Section 27 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 4 by Henry Gray. 5c. The oculomotor nerve. Nervus oculomotorius. Third nerve. The oculomotor nerve supplies somatic motor fibers to all the ocular muscles, except the obliquus superior and rectus lateralis. It also supplies, through its connections with the ciliary ganglion, sympathetic motor fibers to the sphincter pupillae and the ciliaris muscles. The fibers of the oculomotor nerve arise from a nucleus which lies in the grey substance of the floor of the cerebral aqueduct, and extends in front of the aqueduct for a short distance into the floor of the third ventricle. From this nucleus fibers pass through the tegmentum, the red nucleus, and the medial part of the substantia nigra, forming a series of curves with a lateral convexity, and emerge from the oculomotor sulcus on the medial side of the cerebral peduncle. The nucleus of the oculomotor nerve does not consist of a continuous column of cells, but is broken up into a number of smaller nuclei, which are arranged in two groups, anterior and posterior. Those of the posterior group are 6 in number, 5 of which are symmetrical on the two sides of the middle line, while the 6th is centrally placed and is common to the nerves of both sides. The anterior group consists of 2 nuclei, an anteromedial and anterolateral. The nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, considered from a physiological standpoint, can be subdivided into several smaller groups of cells, each group controlling a particular muscle. On emerging from the brain, the nerve is invested with a sheath of pia mater and enclosed in a prolongation from the arachnoid. It passes between the superior cerebellar and posterior cerebral arteries, and then pierces the dura mater in front of and lateral to the posterior clinoid process, passing between the free and detached borders of the tentorium cerebelli. It runs along the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, above the other orbital nerves, receiving in its course 1 or 2 filaments from the cavernous plexus of the sympathetic, and a communicating branch from the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal. It then divides into 2 branches, which enter the orbit through the superior orbital fissure, between the 2 heads of the rectus lateralis. Here the nerve is placed below the trochlear nerve and the frontal and lacrimal branches of the ophthalmic nerve, while the nasociliary nerve is placed between its 2 rami. The superior ramus, the smaller, passes medialward over the optic nerve and supplies the rectus superior and levator palpebrae superioris. The inferior ramus, the larger, divides into 3 branches. One passes beneath the optic nerve to the rectus medialis, another to the rectus inferior. The third and longest runs forward between the recti inferior and lateralis to the obliquus inferior. From the last a short, thick branch is given off to the lower part of the ciliary ganglion, and forms its short root. All these branches enter the muscles on their ocular surfaces, with the exception of the nerve to the obliquus inferior, which enters the muscle at its posterior border. 5d. The trochlear nerve. Nervus trochlearis. Fourth nerve. The trochlear nerve, the smallest of the cranial nerves, supplies the obliquus superior oculi. It arises from a nucleus situated in the floor of the cerebral aqueduct, opposite the upper part of the inferior colliculus. From its origin it runs downward through the tegmentum, and then turns backward into the upper part of the anterior medullary velum. Here it decussates with its fellow of the opposite side, and emerges from the surface of the velum at the side of the frenulum velli, immediately behind the inferior colliculus. The nerve is directed across the superior cerebellar peduncle, and then winds forward around the cerebral peduncle, immediately above the pons, pierces the dura mater in the free border of the tentorium cerebelli, just behind and lateral to the posterior clinoid process, and passes forward in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, between the oculomotor nerve and the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal. It crosses the oculomotor nerve, and enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure. It now becomes the highest of all the nerves, and lies medial to the frontal nerve. In the orbit it passes medialward, above the origin of the levator palpebrae superioris, and finally enters the orbital surface of the obliquus superior. In the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus the trochlear nerve forms communications with the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal with the cavernous plexus of the sympathetic. In the superior orbital fissure it occasionally gives off a branch to the lacrimal nerve. It gives off a recurrent branch which passes backward between the layers of the tentorium cerebelli and divides into 2 or 3 filaments, which may be traced as far as the wall of the transverse sinus. End of section 27.